Hello and welcome back to another edition of YCT Matters. This is Carol Platt-Liebau, the president of Yankee Institute, and today we are bringing you a conversation with the experts. We are very fortunate to be joined today by Representative Holly Cheeseman, who represents East Lyme and Salem and is the ranking member of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee, and Representative Tammy Nuccio, who represents Toland, Vernon, and Willington and is the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee. And we are very delighted and honored to welcome you both to YCT Matters. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
I guess we'll get right down to business since the legislative session is sort of drawing near to a close and the budget is getting into shape and we're beginning to think a little and see a little about what's happening. We were wondering, and I'm sure that the people of Connecticut are in deep suspense about the fiscal guardrails. And could you talk a little bit about that? Because it's our understanding that Governor Lamont and the Republicans and the moderate Democrats want to keep these fiscal guardrails in place, but that the left and the unions are trying to eliminate them. Could you sort of fill everyone in on what the fiscal guardrails are and how that whole dynamic is shaping up?
I don't know who wants to go first. I'll jump in, and then Tammy, Representative Nuccio, you can correct me if I leave anything out. So the fiscal guardrails are, in effect, a result of that 2017 bipartisan budget, when we saw Republicans for the first time in years actually with a seat at the table when the budget was drawn up. After the session that never ended and budgets, minority budget being passed and then vetoed by the governor, in effect, Republicans and Democrats, at a point when Republicans were tied in the Senate within 4 in the House, sat down in a room and said, okay, we are tired of Connecticut being in a permanent fiscal crisis. I remember our great money wonk, Melissa Gebrin, saying in that 2017, there were 5 different deficit budgets created in the course of 6 months, because every time they had a report from the Office of Fiscal Analysis, Connecticut was hemorrhaging more money. Mm-hmm. So in effect, it set up a volatility cap, a spending cap, and a revenue cap, which dictated that in terms of the volatility cap, a lot of the revenue we get is derived from very volatile forms of tax, result of capital gains, those sort of things that vary a lot from year to year. And as opposed to using them to fund ongoing operations, a decision was made that any surplus would go to fill up the rainy day fund, and anything over and above that would go to pay down our huge pension debt. The revenue cap, again, dictates that you have to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tammy, you can only spend up to a certain amount. No, it's a spending cap each year. And the revenue cap, again, basically says, hey, guys, you can't spend every penny that comes in. You have to put some in the bank. You have to budget for less than stay within those guardrails. Have I left anything out, Representative Nuccio?
No, I really don't think so. I think the key thing here, though, is as Holly was just saying, the revenue cap and the spending cap are really kind of imperative, because the spending cap says you can't spend more than the GDP or the inflation in any year, right? So even if you have high revenues coming in like we do right now, you still can't exceed spending. You can't spend even more because those revenues might not be there. And then the revenue cap is the same thing. We just passed legislation this session that it's 98.75% of revenue. You can't spend 100% of all of the revenue because it creates that balance where you are having to put some either in the rainy day fund, which, let's be honest, Connecticut didn't really have one.
Right.
And now we do. And once you exceed that rainy day fund, you have to pay down debt, which, once again, Connecticut has some of the highest unfunded pension and liability debt in the country. So every little bit that you can take and put towards that is easing the burden on our children and our grandchildren who have to pay for the debt that we're incurring by not having good spending policy. So,
and those payments toward the pension debt free up, I think, ongoing $775 million a year in the budget that can then go toward the programs that everybody wants. And I think we actually voted very early in the session to extend those fiscal guardrails for another 5 years. I mean, the governor wanted another 10 years. We would like to have seen another 10 years, but obviously 5 years is better than nothing. And I believe that legislation also increased the amount going forward that we put in the rainy day fund from 15 to 18%. So in effect, making us even more responsible. But Carol, you referenced the desire of some on the left to exceed that, though, to kick over those fiscal guardrails. Indeed,
Right.
There was a proposal that in finance to, in effect, create budget intercepts to take 300 million basically off budget, put it in a fund that would be used to finance whatever this year, and next year to take a percentage of all the sales tax, income tax, the revenue coming in, and put it into a fund which I believe was up to 400 million. So again, sweeping the money before it gets into the general fund and putting it aside for pet projects, which totally violates the purpose of the guardrails and gets us back on the bad old ways.
No,
Yes.
we've seen that. We've seen that happen in the past. And the other portion of this too to really look at is one thing that's not included in either of these fiscal guardrails here is really what we call the carryover spending. So money that's left at the end of the year that's supposed to go into the rainy day fund and supposed to then kind of waterfall down through the rainy day fund to paying off our pension debt. The budgets put before our budget that came out highly utilized that money that's left at the end of the year to pay for ongoing programming, which is, I have an accounting background. Like you don't ever use one-time money to create ongoing expenses. So that money with those guardrails is supposed to go hit that waterfall, the fund, and then into paying down pension. But when you're taking from it before it gets there for spending, especially for spending that's ongoing spending, you're finding the loopholes in the legislation that don't help us. Because as Holly said, when you actually pay down this debt, you're creating more room by not having to pay the interest and everything else for programming. So let's just do it the right way.
And that's the thing that is always sort of interesting to me is all these people on the left who claim to care are actually just creating more indebtedness. And then those interest payments just end up eating up more and more and more of the portion of what should be discretionary spending that goes to take care of the people who need it the most. And, you never know what your needs are going to be down the road. And so what you're doing is you're gambling that, it's okay to just go ahead and eat up the future needs, and say we'd rather just pay all of that later in interest rather than being able to actually use the money for what everyone pays taxes for it to do.
And like you just said, you have to look at it too. It's an albatross around the necks of our young children, right?
Yeah.
My children's children are going to be paying for the teacher's pension and the state unfunded pension liability for teachers that they're never even going to have met, right? Or workers that they're never going to have met.
Couple that with Connecticut's, I think, next to last in the nation performance in terms of our return on our pension investments.
Yes.
This is like a double, triple-edged sword. Not only did we not pay down pension debt, now we are doing it, but I believe the piece by Jeff Sonnenfeld from Yale recently said we could, if we had actually gotten an average return on our pension investments, we could have had a huge, much huger tax cut this year. But simply because we didn't even, perform at the market. And I think last year we forecast 6.9% return, and it's 2%. So, but that's
we don't have the right people driving the financial decisions in this state, and we haven't for a long time. And we're seeing the issues that come along with that. Then you go back to 2017 and the fact that Republicans really pushed and got these guardrails put in place. Like you start to see some fiscal responsible policy. And you start to see a little bit of benefits, but it's like kids in a candy store. It's like, oh,
Right.
wow, we did this. Look at the money we've got in the rainy day fund. What can we spend it on?
Right. Let's go get in there and rate it. Do something
Exactly.
else
The
with it.
jar.
Right.
Come
It's like
on.
it's that fiscal conservatism. Like, I need to have, I need to know that I've got money for if this happens or if that happens. Or we can just spend it all now and, hope that somebody comes and picks up the mess later. So
Right. It's sort of the words impulse control come to mind.
Yes.
this is
Yes.
why
And
it's important to have Republicans at the table. This is why it's important.
And I think you referenced it prior to when us coming on the air, the consensus revenue. Well, we saw with the latest consensus revenue, sales tax returns appear to be robust, but we saw I think it was $600 million decline in that estimates and finals. So
Right.
the surplus, which is still healthy, is way down because those capital, the income taxes paid on capital gains that people paid quarterly were severely reduced. Well, everybody knows what happened to the stock market last year.
Right.
So again, the fiscal guardrails, that money in the past would have been spent on, ongoing operations. Now we still have it, but we are seeing that decline. And if we get away from the good, responsible self-control, fiscal self-control, we would end up in exactly the same situation we were in before.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it really is a little bit like a microcosm of the same sort of decisions that the country writ large faces. And this idea that we just want to keep spending and spending and spending, and where does that get us in the end? It's a terrible situation. And I think, people have heard for so long that, we can't do this, it's unsustainable. And yet they haven't seen the consequences directly on themselves in a way that they recognize, but those consequences do come and they will come. And,
And I think to a certain extent, we are seeing people recognize the consequences in terms of our, net out migration.
Yes.
We have such big tax burdens, and it's not just the super rich who are leaving. It's the people with good middle class incomes and, retirement and pensions who opt to live in a state where there's a lower tax burden. And I think one of the moves that our budget takes in terms of the revenue side is recognizing the burden we've placed on our citizens and attempting to help them, whether it's cutting the general income tax rate or reducing the burden on retirees. Because if if you have an option to live in a state where your Social Security and your pension and your IRA are not going to be taxed, that makes a big difference every year.
You're going there. I'm going there, right? Like you're going to go there.
How can you not? It's just foolishness, to stay. And especially when you sort of get the clue that your money isn't actually going into the programs that you may believe in. It's actually going to pay down debt that was accrued 30 years ago or, whatever down the road. Why in the world would anyone do that? And, more generally, not to digress, but the thing that's so discouraging about the Connecticut tax system, I think, is, other states may have property taxes, but they may not have an income tax, or they may have high energy taxes, but they have a more reasonable property tax. And I think the problem with, some of the way the tax structure here is set up is that there is no tax opportunity, it seems, that has gone neglected. If there's a way to slap a tax on it, it seems like the temptation to do so has never been resisted.
Well, Karen, just look at some of the bills that went through Holly's committee this year, and you're right. Like, we haven't even really delved into property tax piece of this, right? For seniors and stuff. Your property taxes are so onerous in this state. We're one of the highest when you look at that, and it's discouraging because if you look at the majority of your property taxes, it's education, right? And it's been something that I've been fighting for since even before I was elected is, you look at the state of Connecticut's responsibility to educate children, and they abdicate that responsibility to the towns. Excuse me. So then you've got towns who are creating these massive property taxes to pay for education with no differentiation for seniors or anything else. And the state is, unfortunately, if you look at the ECS formula that they have in that, it's not a fair formula. It's put in, excuse me, specifically, it's detrimental to these small towns. And then you have to have higher property taxes to pay for it. Excuse me.
And what, going forward, and again, as we save huge amounts toward the pension debt, do we look at creating some structure similar to Massachusetts? When you do have surpluses, you pass that back to the taxpayer. So do you look at, if we're saving X in terms of pension payments, do we say we dedicate half of that to social programs and half of that maybe return to the towns in forms of enhanced pilot, which would allow them to reduce property taxes, or make general tax, cuts to income taxes? I think we need to be more ingenious as to how we address not only spending, but also how we tax our residents. I mean, Massachusetts has I think, a very good structure in terms of recognizing, let's say, family size. I know in our proposed revenue package, we have for the first time a child tax deduction. So for every child you have, we get a $2,000 deduction against your income tax, because Connecticut doesn't recognize family size. Massachusetts offers relief for renters. Again, they may not pay property tax, but the landlords do. I think, Connecticut's the state of steady habits. I think we need to adopt some disruptive habits to make it, to create a more livable state for the bulk of people, the middle class, and people who run small and medium-sized businesses, who are constantly treated as though they're all Aetna or GE, with huge HR departments and legal departments and compliance departments, which is crazy.
Well, that is one of the things that really constantly amazes me is you want to talk about systemic disadvantage. That is one of the hugest systemic disadvantages I see is what's done to small businesses on a regular basis. And I think the pandemic brought it to light, but then even, the pandemic recovery, I remember until we objected, there was no small business representative on the reopening panel. And some of the original rules, for cleaning and for this and for that, they were things that were appropriate for an Aetna or, just a gigantic business, but something that, a little beauty shop or a little diner. I mean, that things that are staffed by a family where this is their dream. And every time a small business dies, you realize that is someone's blood, sweat, tears, their piece of the American dream that just died. And there's no sensitivity to that at all.
Sure. Yeah.
When we debated the minimum wage, which went on, the increase, which is now going to be $15 and linked to the CPI, so they never have to vote on it again.
Right, and that's an abrogation completely of you want to talk about democracy.
Yeah, referencing.
Well, more importantly, democracy. You talk about how expensive it is to live in Connecticut. It just astounds me that people don't understand basic math. The higher you mandate the minimum wage, that means the price of the product goes up. So you really have a small window where that $15 is going to help you, because then the cost of goods goes up and everything's going to go up again. This is it's not logical that people don't think of this.
And the wage differential, if everybody is starting at 15, that person who is making 16 or 17 now has to be at 20 or 21. And I have to, a small business owner, and I know darn well she does not belong to my party, but said, I can't believe you got rid of the training wage. I have 16 and 17-year-olds. They spend half the time on their phones, I'm all for getting young people into the workforce and teaching them, but why can't I pay them what they're worth, quote unquote? And we've seen, with this new MyCT savings program, the optional mandatory retirement program, because Connecticut residents aren't putting enough aside for retirement. The comptroller had to extend the deadline to August from March 30th, because out of the 20,000 small and medium-sized businesses who were supposed to sign up, I think only 2,000 had. Mm-hmm. But again, I mean, speaking for myself, I run the Niantic Children's Museum as my day job. The letter outlining this program was sent to an employee who hadn't worked there for 15 years.
Right.
If you're the average business owner, that comes in, you throw it in the wastebasket. So
of course.
Yeah, they
I,
don't. There's no connection to these things, right? It's like you hear one person yelling and screaming, you go to help that one person, and in doing so, I tell everybody all the time, everything that we do up here impacts 3.6 million people. It is not a micro. It's not one. It's not one group of people. And we're never stopping to say, how does this flow? How does this interact? How do we make this benefit? They just throw out these laws, like Holly just said, with the retirement thing, and that we're going to make it happen. We're going to do it. But there's no continuity in it. We're making it harder for these small businesses. We're making it more expensive because now the time it takes to administer this means you're not doing something else. So you need somebody else to do the something else. And again, it's like you talk about how expensive it is to live in Connecticut, and everything we seem to do just makes it more expensive. It's it's just doesn't make any logical sense to me. I think everybody should have to take a cost accounting class if they want to be a legislator.
and
Well, we just did mandate financial literacy, Tammy, or the Senate passed it.
An unfunded mandate, a mandate that we're once again going to tell the towns that they have to pay for because, the legislature thinks that this is the right thing to do, but they're not willing to fund it,
No, put
Right.
your money where
Well,
your mouth is, boys and
yeah,
girls.
that or work in or own a small business
Yeah.
so they
Yeah.
could actually see what it's like to meet a payroll, because that's what is amazing is, this sort of attitude on the part of some that just because it's a business, it's almost like some people think there's this hidden store of gold in the back
Yeah.
room somewhere. It's being,
Yeah.
illegitimately hidden from the public
Yeah.
wheel. And it's like these
That all business owners are terrible, capitalist devils
and
who abuse their workers. And as you
Well,
stockpile
they're vacationing in Cabo while the people are doing the work.
and
When
it's
you look at
right.
the average
And they
small
don't,
business owner, right, and the amount of money that they're making, and then when you hear people say, well, they have to pay the $15 and it should just come out of the profit, so then the owner's making $9, right?
Right.
or nothing. How
Right.
many times when you're starting a business,
Right.
you don't pay yourself anything? You pay your employees, you pay the state and the feds and the electricity, EverSource, everybody before you can even take a penny. My late husband used to say, until you've signed the front of the check instead of the back, you don't get it.
right.
Fortunately, there are too many people in Hartford who don't get it.
And to me, that would do more than anything to right the ship, is if people actually had to have that experience up close and personal.
Well, I
Because
think the other part of this too, Carol, though, is like you want to talk about the spending side, right? The government is the only place I've ever experienced in my decades of life here that spend wantonly. Like, there's no consideration to overlap or efficiencies or how do we make this better, and they budget in ways, I'm an accountant. I've been doing budgeting my entire adult life, and going through this budget and talking to all the commissioners and looking at all of the HR policies, and that you build a budget where they're assuming we're going to have magically 3,000, almost 3,400 employees appear on July 1st, and they're going to be full-time, full-year employees, and nobody's going to leave or nothing's going to happen. Nobody's going to go on work. No one's on workman's comp, and we're going to budget that way. And then we wonder why we have all these massive surpluses at the end of the year. I do not know a single real-world business that assumes they are 100% staffed on day one and 100% staffed every single day of the year until they get to December 31st. Right? In government, we do, though. In government, we do. And then we just assume, hey, we've got all this money left at the end of the year. What do you want to spend it on?
Right. And the idea that, you can never reduce anything.
Exactly.
It's just a very interesting mindset that I think if we're all going to prosper in the end, we're all going to have to try and encourage sort of a reset in the thinking, because if something just continuously starts growing, there is that crowding out effect. And so you can either have, a people with a government, or a government with a people attached to it. What I mean? And
there's no accountability to the spending.
Yeah.
There's no results based. There's no metrics.
Exactly. How do
accountability.
Everybody believes in funding effective programs, but if you never look at which programs are actually delivering the end that was desired and just keep throwing them, well, that's been going for 10 years, it must be fine. No, I mean, you don't do that at home.
Yeah.
So why and again, it's not the same. Yeah, yes, at the
It
end
is.
of the day, it is. And we are the stewards of those taxpayer dollars.
Yep.
Right.
And it is our duty to make sure they're being spent effectively and efficiently.
And so as we wind up, I was wondering if there were, one reform that you thought would really, sort of do more than anything else to just at least start steering the ship in a better direction. I know this is sort of a random question, but you're both, right in the middle of things, and you have so many helpful insights. What do you think would be a reform that would really be helpful? I mean, is it zero-based budgeting? Is it a review of all the programs? Is it, what do you think? Would it be allocating before we appropriate? That's always one that kills me, that we appropriate before we allocate. But,
Well, I was just going to go there. Like when we start talking about the laws that we pass and that, right? They pass laws and then try to implement something and then try to change it before they even have any data, right? So, and I'm a data-driven person. So year one for me was just learning the process. Year two for me is going to be really digging in and looking for exactly what you just said there. Where's our overlap? Where's the efficiencies? How do we know that this program is working and doing what we want it to do? And if it's not, I've said since I got here, I would love to see spending in the state of Connecticut, every organization, every dollar that goes out or gets paid to somebody by zip code. I want to know where we're spending our money, right? Because where we have these ongoing, never-ending issues, how much money are we spending there? And if we've been spending, $5 billion a year in one city and we're not seeing any changes and we're not seeing anything get any better, then damn it, what are we doing? We're not doing something right. So how do we tweak that? How do we look at that to say this is what's really going to help this population? And how do we start to really dig in for the overlap? When I ask a question about a program, I often get referred to 3 different organizations. Why do we have 3 different organizations doing the same thing? Where's the efficiency in that, right? We create policy and laws just to keep people employed in this state, just to give people money in this state.
From my point of view, I think it's, what's Tammy and I have been doing, you're sort of creating a true Ways and Means Committee. Yeah. So you are, there is that consultation between the revenue and the spending side. And the other one is one that I put forward, I think every year since I've been there, requiring a 2/3 majority if you're going to pass any unfunded mandates on our municipalities. So
yeah. And you've got like Holly said, I think that's probably one of the best things we can leave this show with. When we decided to do this, when I became ranking on approbes, Holly's been ranking on finance for a while. The first thing I said is, A, we're going to have a budget. And B, it's going to be a budget that is a Ways and Means budget. Holly and I, we sat down, we were talking about, well, if you implement this tax policy, what does that do to what we have in spending? Or if we want to spend this money, if we want to invest in, ECS, I need X amount of money. So what policies can we put in place on tax cuts? Because that's the most important thing right here, is balancing the tax cuts with what we actually need. And we had one document, we're going back and forth, we're looking at the cuts, we're looking at how much does it cost to implement that. That does not get done in the state of Connecticut. It does not get done. And I don't know how anybody puts their head down on their pillow at night and feels good about what they do in Hartford without having that balance and checks. And that's something that Holly and I are going to continue to do that. As long as we're up here and as long as we're rankings, this is going to be an ongoing all the time. If you do that, that means this. How do and how do we make this better?
Maybe we can persuade some other people to join up.
Yeah, right.
Well, you're both extremely persuasive. And that is a wonderfully optimistic note for us to be able to wrap up on, because we're fortunate to have people with the knowledge and the commitment and the principles and the dedication to make that happen. And so I just want to thank you. Thank you both. And that's Representative Holly Cheeseman, the ranking member of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee, and Representative Tammy Nuccio, the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee. As I say, Connecticut is fortunate to have you both. And I am so grateful to you for taking this time to talk us through some of the issues on YCT Matters.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Well, thanks so much. We hope you'll come back.
Anytime.
Okay.
Anytime. Thank you, Carol.
And thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you again. This is Carol Platt-Liebau winding up another edition of YCT Matters.
I'll show you around this place I call home.